If there was one piece of feedback that I got from the last video, it was around beard symmetry. I'd say it ranked about a 2 out of 10 at best. There was a serious leftward lean to it. So before we go any further, Editor Alden, can you double check the beard?
Let me take a look at this. Yeah, it is a lot better. All right, enough of this silliness. Let's get back to business.
All right, as the title card might have implied, we're about to delve into a dangerous topic, politics. But I'm going to do it from a totally nonpartisan, or as best as I can, nonpartisan perspective. My interest in doing this after the election is to talk about some of the things that I learned and realized about our political system and some of the perils of our political system. So my goal is to talk about a bunch of what I think are nonpartisan issues, things that everyone anywhere on the political spectrum could agree to. The first thing I want to get out of the way really quickly is the idea of making Election Day a national holiday. I hear lots of people talking about it, and I think that it's just incredibly critical. Regardless of your perspective, the people of this country who have the right to vote should be given every opportunity to be able to vote. And a big way that we can do that is by shutting down as much of the infrastructure of this country as we can, so that all those people have a day off and they can take the time to go vote. If nothing else comes out of this video, I hope we can all agree that a national holiday for voting would be a good thing for just about everyone involved. So now I want to dive into the first kind of high-level concept that I want to cover, which is the idea of an informed electorate. So I'm going to draw a parallel to the medical field, not because I'm any more expert in the world of medicine than I am in the world of politics, but I think that there's a concept in the world of medicine that a lot of people are very familiar with. And that's the concept of informed consent. The idea is that medical procedures carry risks with them. And it's important for someone undergoing a medical procedure to understand the risks inherent in the procedure and the potential benefits so that they can make a cost-benefit analysis. Now, this is a really hard concept, and I grapple with the idea of informed consent in the world of medicine because I think that it's a bit of a lie, honestly. I think that no individual is going to have a medical degree, and as a result, they're not going to be able to fully and completely understand the risks and all of the intricacies of whatever it is that they are considering having done. So in that way, I think that it is important that we, as people who utilize the medical system, need to find proxies whose values and views align with our own and use them as a resource to bridge the gap in our own knowledge. We can't magically or instantly become an expert on a particular condition or procedure or something like that. But if we found a doctor who sees the world in the same light as we do and also values the same things that we do, then we know that we can trust their judgment in and around the things that we cannot fully understand because we can't get a 8-year medical degree. The reason that I went on this long aside about medicine is because I think that politics is a lot the same. In the same way that none of us are doctors, none of us, or not none of us, I should say, but few of us are lawyers. And as a result, we don't have the ability to delve into the intricacies of the policy that's being written and fully understand the implications of it. As a result, our system of politics really relies on some level of proxy, right? We need other sources to analyze the legislation, look at it, and then help us to make an informed decision. Often this comes in the form of the political parties or particular political figures or third-party researchers going out of their way to try and simplify and help us to understand ballot measures. And I think that that's really important. One thing that I know isn't helping us is the incredible amount of junk mail that's sent. And honestly, I'm bringing this up early in the video because I want to get this off my lap. This is the stack of papers that I received this election day. There are 71 individual brochures about different people, propositions, et cetera, et cetera. And it's a little ridiculous. It's creating an incredible amount of waste, and getting back to what we were just talking about, doesn't materially change how informed we as an electorate are. Reading these pieces of paper doesn't really improve things. And the reason for that is because they are, propaganda is too strong a word, but they are intentionally biased. Each one of those pieces of paper takes a side. It doesn't help inform someone so that they can decide their side. It presents things in a intentionally stilted way in order to try to get someone to act in a certain way. That's what advertising is, and I think it's one of the big problems that we have in the political system, but maybe I'll talk about that another time. Within the sphere of creating an informed electorate, we know that the mail over here isn't really helping us, but I think it's important to talk about some of the resources that I utilized during the last election in the hopes that maybe it will help other people to become more informed and make decisions based on their own values. Because I think that that's what democracy is all about. It's about each individual having as much knowledge as they can about the topics that they're voting on, and then voting on those or voting for the people that represent the kind of change that they want to have. The primary tool that I used during the last election was balot-o-pedia.
Let me take a look at this one. Sound it out, Alden. Balot-pedia. That's a little different than what I was saying, isn't it? All right, I'll fix it in post.
The link will be down below. But
Balot-pedia
is a website that aggregates a great deal of information about what's going on around each candidate, each proposition, state measures, and all the different races, both the high-level ones like president and things like that, all the way down to the reasonably local down-ballot elections. There's 3 sources of information that I think
Balot-pedia
provides that are incredibly important. The first is just a summary of the measures. As we know, an actual proposition is a legal document, which means it's written in a rather ridiculously circuitous way so that no one can really parse out what's going on unless they have a legal degree. So the summary helps to boil things down, and I've found
Balot-pedia
summaries to be very even-handed. The next thing that I like to look at is the supporters. So this is something that you'll often see in the mailings in incomplete forms. But ultimately, the supporters is a list of all of the people who have publicly endorsed a particular measure. Oftentimes, this will be the Democratic Party favors one, the Republican Party favors the other one, and then there'll be a bunch of other ancillary organizations that have come out on one side or the other. And I find that really helpful because it helps me to clarify where the interests are and things like that. Then the third thing, and honestly, this is the silver bullet from my perspective in all of this, is
Balot-pedia
breaks down the total money that was spent on each of these races. And beyond the total money spent, it also breaks down the individual donors. It's very useful to be able to look and see where the money is. For this particular example, I'm going to go ahead and bring up Proposition 22, which has become kind of infamous. I'm in California, so I'm particularly familiar with it. But what we learned from Proposition 22, regardless of which side you come down on, is that money can have a big influence on things. As you can see in the graphic to the left here, a lot of money was spent on Proposition 22. Over $200 million, just in favor of the measure. The opposition raised a significantly smaller amount of money. So I think that this is one thing that has always been very dangerous. And I'm particularly attuned to it because I've seen the way that advertising in all of its forms can influence behavior. And I think that there is a danger that a democracy in which people are too easily manipulated can stop being about the interests of the people that the democracy is designed to serve. That, again, is a whole other video, but I think that the role of money is not to be underestimated. With Prop 22, the thing that I took away from
Balot-pedia
was the fact that basically all of the money that came in support of Prop 22 came from the gig economy companies, Uber, Lyft, Postmates, etc. And that told me personally as a voter a lot more than the summary did, or how much fundraising was done, or really any of the other information that I could get access to. The core thing that I learned was whose interests are at stake here and how important is it to people. And the short answer is Prop 22 getting passed was apparently staggeringly important to the companies who utilize workers that would be affected by the proposition. That to me is a high-level overview of the way that I approach trying to become a more informed elector. It's not perfect, but I'm able to find some of the resources that help me align and understand what's going on in the world as it relates to me, and also the ways in which I want to influence and affect the world where I can. So hopefully that was helpful just to illuminate the way I personally approach trying to be an informed part of our electorate. I want that for everyone as best they can, but I also know that that was a really time-consuming process. I set aside like 3 solid hours to go through all the ballot measures for California, but there were a lot of them, to be clear. But that's asking a lot of every person in the United States. But I think that it's important, and I think that it's part of the process by which we make systemic change and create a democracy that serves the people. Because I think that that's something that's a bit lost, and I'll probably talk about that more in the future. The other big thing that I want to talk about is the relationship between the news media and the government. And it's something that was brought into kind of stark relief for me during this election cycle, more so than previously. I don't know if other people had this experience, but the news media told us day after day leading up to the election that we wouldn't know the results that day. And that's fair, right? We're in the middle of a pandemic, things are really complicated. So they prepped us, I think, reasonably well. Then the day of the election came and went, and there was a lot of uncertainty after the election. And I think everyone felt that very heavily on both sides of the election. For me, I think the most interesting part of this whole process was the Friday and Saturday following the elections. On Friday, an organization called Decision Desk HQ officially called the election. And then nothing happened, which I thought was really interesting. It wasn't until the next day that the news media started calling the election. I'm not going to speculate as to why that's the case, but it struck me as very odd, and it really was the inspiration for this video more than anything. 100 years and 2 weeks ago, basically today, give or take, the first election result was broadcast on the radio. In 1920, on November 2nd, by KDKA Pittsburgh. That kind of blew my mind. And I think that that moment in American history was really critical because it was a technological marvel. We now had this capability that we never had before to be able to beam information to basically everyone in this country incredibly quickly. And that's a game changer. And I think that that immediacy, that role that suddenly the news media took on has grown and morphed over the last 100 years. And it's changed into something that I think is a little problematic. And I think that our recent election kind of proved that out. And I want to try and explain why. I have a background in computer science. And a big part of computer science these days is modeling. Roughly speaking, modeling is the act of collecting data, feeding it into a model, and then getting some type of results. In the simplest case, when we think about modeling, we often think about the work that the news media does in the lead up to an election with polling data. They'll collect polling data, that's their data source. They'll feed it into models that extrapolate and try and understand the significance of that data, and then those models will spit out a result. One of the problems, though, that I saw in this election is that I don't think there was a lot of clarity about what happens next. And what I mean by that is once votes start getting counted, it's not like the models go away. Instead, the news media supplants one type of model for a different type of model. They go from a model that's driven by polling data that tries to extrapolate forward to models that use partial results in order to extrapolate full results. And so that's the way that news networks are able to predict the outcome of the election before all the votes are counted. That process of modeling relies heavily on partial results. The challenge with partial results is that they have their own biases, right? As we saw in the last election, mail-in ballots were cast by more Democrats than Republicans as an example of one of these biases. And so as a result, the model creators that are creating the predictive models that help the news networks to call the election as quickly as possible have to correct for that bias. That's why when we look at a map of the United States that will hopefully be showing over here, I think one that was provided by NPR, what we'll see is that the day after the election, even though not that many votes were counted in many places, the predictive models were able to come up with an outcome that was so statistically likely that the news networks were willing to consider it fact. So that's the system. And I think there's not a lot of transparency or clarity in that second piece of the system for a lot of, I'm going to say both viewers of the political circus, but also the news media itself. I don't think that the news media is being responsible in the way that it articulates the kinds of results that it's showing. Before moving on, I want to harp on another problem that we have. Elections have become more about the spectacle than anything else. And I think that personally, I've grown weary of the spectacle. It feels like politics has become more primetime television than the way that we govern our country. And to me personally, that's exhausting. And so whenever we can, wherever we can, removing the levers that allow that, I think is important. The 24-hour news cycle has created a really difficult to navigate set of incentives. The idea that we need results as quickly as possible is not something that has to be that way. It is, however, something that has been designed that way, right? It's good television. The uncertainty and the creeping towards a final result is something that is very, I'm not even going to say entertaining to watch, because if you are anything like me, it wasn't entertaining, it was stressful. I'm not sure what it is, but it is addictive. And I think that that in and of itself is problematic. But beyond that, I think that our government has become complicit in that spectacle. And that's really kind of the final point that I want to talk about here, which is that the way that the government handles counting the votes is really designed and built around this model of we gotta go fast, we need to deliver partial results as quickly as possible, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that that's a bad underlying assumption. I think that the results of the election should be delivered in a way that favors clarity over spectacle 100% of the time. My proposal for the way that I think that should be changed is I don't think that states should release partial results at all. I think a state should have to complete counting all of its ballots before it can release any of the results. I think that that's something that should be governmentally mandated. The reason that I think this is so important is because it would force clarity in what the news organizations are doing. They would no longer be able to take these partial results and deliver model predictions as rote fact, and it would force them to be more honest about the types of speculation that they're doing. I realize that this might delay results coming in from the election, which I don't think is what any of us want. No matter who you are, it's not fun waiting. The challenge, though, is right now we've seen legislation passed that actively slows down the process of counting ballots. I think the most notorious was Pennsylvania, who wasn't allowed to count mail-in ballots until all of the same-day ballots were counted. I'm not going to delve into the political motivations for why I think that legislation was created, but I think that in a world where no results were released until all of the results were 100% counted, that legislation would make a lot less sense and accomplish a lot less. And I think it would incentivize our government as a whole to always favor more expedient ways of counting ballots. And I think that's really, really important. I think that we should get the results from Election Day as quickly as we can while counting every single vote and confirming that all of the numbers that we are presenting are not speculative, but in fact 100% grounded in reality. Just to delve a little bit into the way that this would work, since I think it's important as part of understanding it. The idea that I'm proposing would require states to count every ballot before they could release any portion of the vote. What that would mean is, unlike the diagram from NPR, I'll bring it up again over here, each one of those squares would either be filled in blue or filled in red. And there would be no ambiguity, there would be no votes continuing to come in, and the election would only be called when a sufficient number of states had completely reported their vote tally, and that vote tally was not in dispute. There would still be plenty of time in the weeks following the election for recounts to be adjudicated and all those types of things. We just wouldn't start that process until the vote was done being counted the first time. If we think about the way that models would look in a future where states could only report full counts, what we would have is the models that news networks have access to would be polling data enriched with exit polling data. That's not something that's easily passed off as fact. And what that would mean is that news networks would no longer have the ability to call the election. That responsibility would be up to the states and to the federal government, which, as an aside, is the way it should be. Going back to that weird Friday and Saturday experience that I had, it didn't make sense to me when I really thought about it that the ultimate arbiters of when the election is over is not the federal government, at least in the eyes of the American people for the most part. I can tell that based on the fact that I got a bunch of text messages on Saturday, and the only thing that had changed was news networks had decided to declare the election over. It wasn't that the votes were done being tallied. It wasn't that any of the governmental processes that needed to take place had. It was simply that a group of people who report the news got together and made a decision based on the data that they had at their disposal. And I don't think that that is a responsibility that we want to leave in the hands of people who are not elected officials, people who are only beholden to ratings and not beholden to the American people and able to be held accountable by the American people. I think that that's too much power to put in the hands of news media. And I think that news media should be welcome to speculate to their heart's content, but the data that they have access to should be as factual as possible and should not lead to the kind of rampant speculation that we see in today's election coverage. In talking to folks about this proposal, one of the things that's been brought up a couple of times is the fact that this would lessen transparency. And I think that that's an important topic to talk about because I don't think that it necessarily has to be that way. I don't think that getting a live drip of 2,000 ballots at a time for any given state actually increases transparency. I think that at the end of the count, when all of the ballots have been counted, a great deal of information about the order in which they were counted, where the ballots came from, and things like that would be available that would allow the same kind of forensics that's done today to ensure that there was no tampering with or no issues with the vote count. So I don't think transparency is particularly important in that regard. And in fact, I'll bring up this graph really quickly because I think it's a bit infamous, but this graph is, in my opinion, one of the strongest arguments against the trickle count approach. I think that this is very deceptive and confusing and leads to a lot of spectacle and doesn't really benefit the electorate in terms of its understanding of any portion of the way that this works. Specifically, this graph could be produced at the end and still shared, but we would know that it's not particularly useful because the order in which ballots are counted does not in any way affect the importance of any individual vote. The first vote that counts should count for the same amount as the last vote that counts. Okay, so now that we've gotten all that out of the way, just to summarize, the two propositions that I have for the world that I am choosing to share in this video is one, make Election Day a national holiday, and two, force states to only report complete results of their entire ballot count. I think that if we were to do these two things, it would create a great deal of clarity and it would disincentivize news organizations from taking their predictions and masquerading them as hard and true fact, which I think was very harmful in this last election and is generally harmful to the democratic process as a whole. If this makes sense to you and you like the way that I presented it here, I would encourage you to share this video with others, because the value of this platform to me is that I can share my ideas and improve things for all of us. That's why I want to create these videos. Thank you for watching my now second video, hopefully with at least 4 times the beard symmetry of previous videos, and also with a slightly more kempt mane. Unsure about that one. We'll see. But yeah, thank you for tuning in. Hope that you're having a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next one.
Not a potamus. Ponderous.